everyone, and welcome to the Metacast by Naavik, a podcast in which we explore the business and future of video games. I'm Aaron Bush, and in this episode, I'm thrilled to host a conversation with Emily Greer. Emily is an industry legend who I've learned a lot from at a distance, and I'm really excited to have a more personal conversation today. Emily, welcome to the Metacast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Sweet. And many people may know of you as a co-founder and COO and then CEO at Kongragate, but your story is also bigger than that. So to set the stage for everything that we'll dig into today, how would you describe your games industry journey so far?
I definitely have, I think, a one-of-one path through the games industry, starting with I have only ever been a founder in the games industry and came in with no real games background. So the sort of origin story is that my mother and I grew up playing PC games together. Our mom was really into computers and always had the newest computer. So, in the 1980, we were like the one house on the block that had an Apple, and we would, play all sorts of games on it. My brother really loved the Ultima series. I was a big fan of Lode Runner, the old Broderbund game. And, that's, how we grew up. And then we split off and went to college, and Jim ended up dropping out of college to work on the Ultima series when he got the chance, and got into the games industry as an engineer. And now that I had my main person that I played games with was no longer with me, I kind of stopped playing games. It exaggerated because that was also when games started going really 3D, and I have a inner ear problem that makes me really unusually sensitive to camera motion. I have problems in movies, even like if they're like fast cut or short held, and like seeing Doom being played across the computer lab was enough to make me sick. So I sort of went away from games for a little while, but it was always in there in me, and I sort of became this kind of classic casual gamer who played a lot of Bejeweled on her flip phone and, Pop It on Pogo and various other things, and became, this 2D solo gamer who didn't talk about it with her friends. I didn't even talk about it with my brother because he was in kind of core game making land. I finished college and sort of stumbled into catalog and e-commerce direct marketing, and fell in love with sort of data and using data to understand, how the world is working, how business is working, how decisions are made. So I did spent about 10 years in the catalog e-commerce industry doing what we would now call, data science and UA, but was not called that then. Right. And it's actually been kind of amazing because I thought when my brother had the idea for Kongragate, I started helping him with his business plan, and because I knew much more about business than he did, and then volunteered as co-founder. I thought I was going to be doing something completely different. And for about 9 months I was. And then, our Kongragate launched, and, every year, everything that I learned in that sort of prior to games experience has become kind of more and more relevant. So it's a sort of a strange story of I was in an great apprenticeship for the games industry, only neither I nor the games industry knew it at the time.
Love it. And I was probably a day one, or about as close as a day one user of Kongragate as you could get. I know I was in school at the time, and we definitely played the game. There was several years of which it was like a cat and mouse game between, the administrators and the students to try to make us not play Kongragate games, but we would always still find a way. So I
actually think that the fact that, almost all the other Flash game sites had games somewhere in their name. And I think that Kongragate had an early advantage in the school market because it was if you're scanning a list of URLs, it wasn't obviously a game site. So I think we were kind of kept up in more places a little bit longer because we weren't called addicting games or, some such thing.
Absolutely. So let's talk a bit more about what you're building today. And then I want to spend some time also looking back on all that you've learned and how you've evolved as a serial entrepreneur and CEO. And somewhat selfishly in that too, as someone who's new to the games industry, doesn't have that games background similar to you when you started. But maybe to start, I just want to ask, why go back to square one and start another games company? Like what motivated you to do that?
Uh, there is a real truth that sort of for the kind of person who becomes an entrepreneur, it is a little bit of an addiction because there's something about starting a company and having that small team and that big space of possibility and the excitement of that is really just really meaningful in a way that sort of working within a larger corporation, you have less agency and less, kind of ability to shape things. The other thing for me is, so, I came into the games industry co-founding Kongregate, which was a platform. So we built that. And then when I took over as CEO, we went into mobile as a third party and then first party publisher. So I'd done that, but I hadn't actually made games. And so I'd been in the industry a really long time and was kind of gradually, coming in like 30,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 5,000 feet. But games are fun. I wanted to actually make them and have that experience. And I thought that there was an opportunity as somebody who, most people who get into the games industry, it's sort of a passion industry, and most have kind of the core gamer identity. I'm a little unusual in that I'm an industry veteran who has a classic, so-called casual gamer identity. And I thought that, there's an opportunity. The best games are the games that you make for yourself, right? And I felt like there was an opportunity to, build games kind of from the ground up with that perspective on this market and, and what is frankly, about the biggest part of the industry. I mean, sort of mobile overall is now the majority. And just even though it is now a mature market, really feeling the opportunity there. But so that was a big part of it. But also I kind of, running a larger company, I missed that stage when we were, 10 people building one thing, and kind of wanted another crack at it.
Awesome. Well, let's dig into that a little bit more. Your current company is Double Loop Games, which, as it says on your LinkedIn, is a new mobile studio dedicated to making delightful, relaxing experiences for the biggest audience in games, people who don't think of themselves as gamers. So I know you can't go too deep on the details of your game yet, but Emily, can you unpack this thesis for us some more and maybe just tell us at a high level what you're building?
So it's a complicated way of saying things, and I think actually it's something that people often misunderstand as getting people to play games who don't usually play games. And that's not what we're sort of focused on at all. What it really comes down to is I really hate the word casual and the distinction of core casual that we've built up in the industry. Among other things, as soon as you call one thing core, you're describing everything else is sort of peripheral and lesser. And that's something that's really bothered me for a long time. I also think that, there are casual players of games, but I think they exist across the spectrum and play a lot of different things. I think there are casual players of like people who pick up FIFA with their friends, once every 2 months, or Madden or Call of Duty. That's one kind of casual player. Somebody who just wants to play, the equivalent, the hyper casual games, which are the equivalent of, flash games, what flash games were in their day, a very simple thing. That is a true casual player. But when you you look at the sort of the big meat of the so-called casual market, you're looking at people who are mostly playing, 6 and 7 days a week, playing, 45 minutes to an hour a day, and really invested and really treating games as their hobby. And that audience to me is really misnomered when you call it casual. So that's what my sentence there is trying to unpack. Is actually what we want to do is make really deep games for this audience, games that are accessible, but games that also sort of unfold and are things that you can play not just for a few hours or a few weeks, but for years, and have them be really meaningful. So we sometimes joke that our real goal is to make MMOs for moms, and that's a reduction, but I actually think it kind of gives you a little bit of a feel of what our dream is. Will we achieve it? I don't know. MMOs are hard, and onboarding people into things is difficult. But I think part of this is driven by my journey as of having been, become a truly, that classic casual gamer, and then, getting into CCG guilds because I was part of Kongregate and really loving it and feeling like, okay, this is an experience that I think can be meaningful to a lot of people, and I want to kind of work on bridging that gap and helping build those games.
Sweet. Well, that sounds really exciting. I'm excited to learn more about what you're building when you're ready to share. But maybe just to talk about the company side a little bit more. What is the state of Double Loop these games? How big is the team at this point? What have you raised? Any other interesting details there?
Yeah, so we are 18 full-time employees across US and Canada, mostly on the West Coast, and then plus some additional full-time contractors. So probably working full-time on the game somewhere in the kind of 20, 22 people range. So, small enough that everybody knows everybody and you can talk to the whole team easily, but also, big enough that you can actually, get a substantial amount done. Hopefully, knock on wood. And we've raised 10.5 million, but in 2 rounds. We did a seed round that was led by LVP with One Up Ventures also participating, plus some industry angels. And then we did an A round led by Hero Capital with various people also participating, LVP again, Garena, Riot, and again, some, individuals and family offices as well.
Sweet. And I know you also raised money for Kongragate back in 2006, 2010, I believe, that time period. So I'd love to hear your view on, as a founder, how has the funding environment in the games industry changed since then? And then maybe as a follow up, I'm just curious, why these investors for you?
Yeah. So, I mean, it is just an absolutely massive change. And that is actually part of what contributed to me being willing to and feeling up for starting Double Loop, was that I felt like that the venture industry was finally really starting to understand games, and that much better funding opportunities existed than had previously. So, in 2006, games really were not funded by venture capital at all. We kind of snuck in because we were a platform with around games. And so investors really liked it, that they could kind of get near games, which they could tell what, was a big and growing industry. But they had sort of firmly fixed in their heads that, games were hit driven, not a sustainable business, that they weren't, good judgments of it, and they should just leave it to the publishers. So when we were raising, we focused entirely on the fact that we were a platform. We were competing for that. And really, we didn't speak to anybody who knew games very well at all. I think the one exception was Benchmark had Mitch Lasky just joining in that period, who had, a great background as an Activision exec and running Jamdat. But that was like the one person in Silicon Valley who really knew games. And they didn't even play games very much. So we were sort of kind of really focused on, platform. There was a brief rise where, when Facebook games took off, and that was, Facebook was a platform that they were invested in. And then there was a brief flurry of, okay, we're going to invest a lot of money. But of course, we know what happened with Facebook games. So for mostly that turned out not to be great investments and just reinforced that thesis that, games are hit driven, when really what it was is that, iPhone mobile came around, right at this moment of great discovery, and all of the audience shifted. But what had been built in terms of kind of the games in the industry was really lasting. So it went back to being kind of a winner of games. Then I think, kind of post-social, social mobile burst, kind of 2012 through 2016, it was really kind of a wasteland. There was, the main VCs really weren't touching games at all. There was LVP in London, who are ex-games folks, who'd been investors in Supercell and Unity and made a lot of good, the sort of the best bets in that period. And so they kind of, were able to weather it and keep building. And then, games went through this great transformation to kind of a free to play and, games as a service model, or even, console games are really services now. And then VCs started to be like, oh, okay, this is, yes, it's hit driven, but it's hit driven in the same way that all venture investments is hit driven. And once you have a hit, you can sustain it for a very long time and have better multiples, et cetera. So it just really set the stage for kind of a new flowering and a big, round of investment. So now there are, I think when we raised our A, I ended up talking to 70 different investors who are people who invest in games. And that, I think we talked to, less than 20 when we were raising for Kongragate, and, no real games people. And now there's just a host of dedicated investment. And on top of that, I think another thing was sort of pioneered by Y Combinator in a way was kind of the building of community amongst startups and have them help each other is a big difference. I don't remember ever meeting another Greylock portfolio company in that 2006, 2010 period. Whatever sort of startup community we built was just, individually knowing people in the Bay Area and getting together. Whereas now, OneUp is one of our investors, and they're really focused on doing these smaller, broad bets and creating, groups of, 50 investees at a time and bringing us together regularly on calls, in-person summit, building that community and having us help each other. LVP does a summit. Just in the last 6 weeks, I've been to 2 different investor summits, and, it's an amazing difference versus our first experience of just being able to, quickly message another founder and say, how are you handling this? Have you used this service? What are you doing about this? And it's a much sort of richer and less lonely experience to found a games company now than it was before. And that's something that I've personally really appreciated compared to our first go round.
I really would like to spend some time looking back and discussing what you've learned and how you've improved as an entrepreneur. Since 2006 when you co-founded Kongragate, and maybe to kick this off, when you look back at your time at Kongragate, I'd just like to know, what are you most proud of what you and the team accomplished there, and then also maybe a reflection on the flip side of that is there anything you wish you knew that would have helped you do something better, and then we can dive into more specifics.
Yeah, I think with Kongragate, we were part of this great, Flash games boom that really enabled people, all over the world, very far from the traditional game development centers, to make games and build them and become professionals and get into the industry. And that has changed a lot of lives and helped build game industries kind of all over the world in places that it didn't have before. And while we were only I think, one part of what happened there, I think the biggest role that we had in Kongragate is that we came in and said, hey, you should be paid for your games and get revenue on the views. Prior to Kongragate, all of the Flash sites were just kind of, grabbing Swift files and putting them up. And once your game was out there, you lost all visibility into what was happening. You had no revenue. The only thing that a Flash developer in the early days could make money was by selling, sponsorship rights at the beginning, and there was no, market for it. So, people were making these games that had billions of views and getting, $100 from, a portal was all they ever saw of that. So when we came in, and then sort of right around the same time, a company called Mochi came in and said, okay, if we're making ad revenue, you should make ad revenue, upload, have control of it, keep track of it. And, there are a lot of, really amazing careers that sort of flowered out of that. There's a great studio in Indonesia that made the Infectinator games and are now, they are released a game, Coffee Talk, on Steam this year. They're in their, 10th year. The Ironhide games, who made Kingdom Rush in Uruguay, and there's a whole little, game industry in Uruguay now and Indonesia and places that weren't there. So that's something, all the careers that started and that we were a little part of is what I'm most proud of. I run into people all the time in the games industry who tell me, oh, the first thing I did was make Flash games and put it on Kongragate. And that just warms my heart every time.
Awesome. What about the flip side? Something that you wish that you knew that you didn't, at least early on?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things in terms of just, running a company and maturity of it. I think, we were really sort of random and not thoughtful enough in terms of salaries and equity and what's fair and what's between people. And, there's I feel like we made a lot of mistakes in terms of compensation and team building early in Kongragate that we were sort of living with and digging ourselves out of, 3 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later, because, once we got bought by GameStop, things got really, really locked in. So that's one part of it. I think the other part is, when we started, it was, we were, me and a bunch of young engineers, and we had a really sort of fun, but kind of hard drinking, kind of wilder culture. And I there were things that that were things that were happening that I wasn't fully comfortable with, but I didn't want to not be one of the guys, right? And I, that feeling of I didn't want to be like the buzzkill. And so there were sort of, it moderated over time, but there were definitely sort of early parts of Kongragate culture that I really wouldn't want to recreate, because it was kind of very much part of that sort of like bro, drink until 3, people go onto a strip club kind of thing that, wasn't sort of welcoming to people who didn't drink, and was, personally uncomfortable sometimes for me as a woman in the group. But, you feel like you should go along. And so I did.
Right. Well, that's a good setup to dig into more details of how you're approaching double loop games, and how you've changed as an entrepreneur, and how your thinking has changed around the very early days of starting, how you're thinking about scaling culture, all of that. So let's go ahead and roll through some of that. Maybe to start with the founding piece, which when you founded Double Loop Games, how did you start it, similarly or differently to Kongragate? You mentioned the culture piece, but are there any other lessons that you carried over that made the process of getting off the ground easier and more successful?
Yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, there was a lot of similarities in terms of how Kongragate started and how Double Loop started. Only, last time it was my brother having the idea, and this time it was me. But it's the idea that sort of takes you over, and like you can't stop thinking about it, and like you write up your the one sheet of like what you want to do, like how you want to think about it, what the opportunity is. And yeah, I had the idea, but then waited for just a little while to see, okay, can I stop thinking about it? No, okay, then cool, I can go ahead and leave Kongragate and overturn my life for this. I think, and then I really wanted a co-founder. Having co-founded with my brother before, I really missed him when he left. And kind of like the worst year for me in Kongragate was the year after he left, before I hired kind of a great CEO, Pani Harataros, who became essentially my second co-founder. So, I really, really wanted, a great partner, and somebody who complemented me in terms of both in terms of approach and in terms of knowledge. So, I talked to a bunch of people that I knew, and ended up convincing my co-founder Shelby to join. I've got the startup and publishing and marketing and business background, and then she has the designer, production, like from the ground game development. And we spent a lot of talking and figuring out, okay, making sure that we were on the same page in terms of the vision for the company, coming up with game ideas, how do we mediate conflict, things like that. So a lot of that process was based on, okay, having had the experience of co-founding, and wanting to try and get that right. There's a lot that was a lot easier because of having built a company before, and actually knowing what happens when you get investment, and also when you get acquired, and things like things that seem stupid, but literally having a very organized folder that has every contract I've ever signed in it, which is definitely that kind of organization and sort of thoughtfulness is something that I spent so much time trying to chase down, miscellaneous contracts and at Kongragate later. It doesn't sound exciting, but honestly, it is something that ended up mattering. So there's a lot of details.
Scary. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of details around company foundation, sort of organization, making sure tax and legal and payroll is set up right, knowing a lot about kind of accounting and making sure that that's done right from the beginning so that you don't have to fix it later. So a lot of it is about this kind of boring administrative stuff that does make your life a lot easier later. I think the other thing some that I knew was and learned is just like how important that initial culture is, and having that the first, 5 people in a company really determine so much about how things are going to go, and that every habit that you build in the first 3 months, 6 months, year are things that are going to set the foundation for everybody else. And so I think there's various things where we were thoughtful and talked about, okay, what are the long-term consequences of something, and that includes like, how do we do salaries? How do we do this? How do we do that? How do we do, deploys, that all come from the experience of having, dealt with the problems caused by hasty decisions, and things like, we had a HR contractor, at when we were 8-9 people, who's not full time, but is somebody who can help us out and just make sure that we're doing things right from the beginning. And I think that's something that's quite different.
Awesome. That's really great advice. Some of that I'll probably even take for myself, like the folder of contracts. Yeah, already starting to feel that pinch a little bit as a first time
Yes.
founder. So
Yep. And
fun stuff.
yeah, the contracts thing, man, like it just bites you so hard.
That's funny. Well, how about the scaling side of things? Kongregate obviously went through quite a lot of growth, but also quite a lot of change over the years. Are there, any top lesson on scalability or adaptability from Kongregate that you're thinking about carrying over to Double Loop?
Yeah. So the thing about with Kongragate is that we were, there was like a few months when it was just me and, my brother and like one other person. And then very quickly we were between 10 and 20 people, and we stayed at that size, like 17 people, until GameStop bought us. And that was like 4 years at that one size. And then we grew very, very gradually, like one person for a while after that. So we had this really extended people period where we were under 30 people. And we actually, we had a lot of, I think a really good culture, really sort of open, good discussions, all that kind, a lot of, psychological safety, and we thought that it would just keep working like that when we got bigger. But what happened is when we went into mobile and, the web business had been growing really strongly, and then we started mobile and we went from, I think, like 35 people to 70 people in about 18 months, and everything broke. Everything in terms of like, communication and culture. Like we started having like fighting and in factions, and kind of the web versus mobile team, and things that I'd taken for granted that just worked when we were smaller stopped working. And the thing that I've kind of like image I now have in my mind is that like communication and culture, like you should think about it around table size, that like, if your team is small enough to sit around like one table and like say 6 people, 8 people, and have one conversation, that's one culture. If you can all fit in like, you're 14 people and you can fit in one long restaurant table, but it's going to be different conversations on either side, that's a different culture. Then, you need multiple long tables. Then you need a whole restaurant. Then you need double restaurant. Each of those places, like that's a different breaking point. And, thinking about it in terms of like that sort of spatial communication helps me envision when it's going to be when things are going to change and when things are going to be a problem, and thinking about, okay, how do you make things not dependent on me? there was a lot of things at Kongragate that it was just, oh, I can just do. But then when I needed to go off and, sell the company or raise financing and disappeared, it was a choke point. And trying to kind of get ahead of those this time and push down and make sure that everybody sees the vision and is empowered to, kind of carry it forward. We could feel the difference between, 10 people working on the vertical slice and, 20 people working on soft launch now. But it's still at a pretty easy point. I know at the point that you go to 2 teams, then things really, really change. I would try to get ahead of it, but there are some things you just kind of have to, there's always going to be some turmoil and turbulence. But I think the key thing is thinking about, what vision do people have a clear vision of what they're working on, and are they empowered and feel the safety and trust to work on it? And that's when you're going to have the most effective and happiest team.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, let's talk about the future side of things. So I'm curious, if the way that you think about the end game, the long-term goal of a company, how you think about exits, has changed in any way. In Kongragate, it got acquired by GameStop, and then again got sold to MTG. And I'm sure you learned a lot from going through all of that. But I'm curious if there are any notable lessons from that time, and how it's impacted the way that you're thinking about where Double Loop is eventually going in the future.
Yeah. Selling the same company twice is like a weird particular grind achievement for an entrepreneur.
Achievement unlocked.
So it takes us like a certain amount of longevity for that to work. So I think, the Kongragate experience it was really, really valuable, both for going through 2 different acquisitions, but then being on the inside. And we also made acquisitions. So we bought, I think, 4 studios while I was there. So I've been on both sides of the transaction. And that sort of really kind of opened my eyes to how the other party is thinking about it. It's thinking about it within the context of a public company. So most acquirers tend to be public companies, and they have, their long-term vision, and then, quarterly goals. And then there's a lot of play between what kind of multiple of earnings your company is versus what multiple that public company is getting. So when, deals are happening, left, right, and center in the games industry, a year or 2 ago, is partly because the public companies were getting really good multiples. And so it made it easier for them to buy, other companies at attractive multiples. So that understanding that dynamic is important. When a company doesn't have earnings, then you're selling, right? Like when it's not yet profitable, then you're selling kind of the growth, the dream, the integration. With game studios, it really should be on earnings. So, a platform is much easier to sell on the potential and the growth and the dream. And honestly, that's what we did at Kongragate. We were break even when they bought us, and became, grew a lot under GameStop and became profitable. But we grew into our what they paid for us, like after they bought us, which is actually something that I'm proud of, right? That a lot of acquisitions is where companies go to die, and I think we increased our revenue something like 17 times, wow. 17x what they bought us for while we were there. So that, and that actually is a story of a good acquisition, right? That, they bought us, and not only did I stay through 7 years at GameStop, most of the core team did. I think We had like 7 of the first 10 Kongragate employees were still there when GameStop sold us. And that was, they knew that they didn't know what we were doing. They didn't understand our market. And as long as we kept growing rapidly, they were like, cool, go ahead. So it still really felt like my company, our company, executing the vision. But what happened is, we kept growing and they started shrinking and things started, colliding a little bit in terms of what we could invest and what we could do, which is when we started to, mutually agreed, okay, it's better for Kongragate to get out of GameStop, and started looking for NTG as a home. So, as soon as you take investment, you are saying at some point, I'm going to exit, right? Like, this is the promise that you are making to somebody investing money in your company. The question is it going to be an acquisition or is it going to be an IPO? 98% of the time, it's going to be an acquisition. So building Double Loop, I'm thinking about, okay, what kind of company do they want to acquire? What state do I want our company to be in to have the best possible exit, and also land in an environment that is going to be sort of healthy for the studio and the acquirer long term? Like, nothing necessarily lasts forever. Like, GameStop, it was 7 years, but it was a good, 6 of those 7 years were good for both of us. And that's something that, I would want again. So, I'm thinking about is like what I want to build is a company with really sustained profitability, profitability and like clear potential for long-term growth, but also stability. Public companies love growth, but even more, they love consistent earnings because that's what the market's like. So games are actually really like a long-term game with really good retention and consistent monetization is actually a great fit with that. And, I want to build, the name Double Loop comes from, wanting to build hobby games. So besides games, my other hobby is figure skating, and loops are important in both of them. And then Double Loop is the infinity symbol. So for long term. So it's all this idea of building, a long-term game, things that people really want to play forever, that our hobbies are meaningful. So that's great for players, but it's also great for acquirers, right? Is that, Candy Crush, my God, like, they are the stability of Activision these days. And so, part of, again, my confidence in like, I want to try again, I want to build, was I could see a vision for a company that was what players want, what I as a developer want, and was going to be a good business and a good potential for exit. And then when I think about exit, I think about, I want to get into an environment where, it still feels like my company, right? Where all of my team, it still feels that ownership and brand and agency to keep building games. And that's something I think actually the games industry has improved on a lot in terms of acquisitions. Now, you talk like, Microsoft and Zynga and all these other, Tencent, all these other acquirers now brag about, leaving studios alone and letting them kind of build their vision. And they recognize that that is a better environment. So I'm optimistic that, hopefully we have a great success. And when the time comes, we'll have a choice of, of good homes for the studio.
Cool. I'm just kicking myself. I read on your profile on the website that you like figure skating. I'm just kicking myself that I didn't piece the whole Double Loop thing together.
I meant it to be like this kind of Easter egg. So all of my figure skating friends immediately are like, "Oh, that's a figure skating reference." But like to games industry broader, nobody gets it, and I like that.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Well, in our final 5 or 6 minutes or so, I want to try hitting on a couple culture questions here. I think it's
Mhm.
really important. And part of why I wanted to talk to you is because even from a distance, I've admired your ability to not just preach platitudes about culture, but you genuinely have a very deep, nuanced, and methodical way of thinking about, policies and the way culture should be run.
Mhm.
So maybe to start, we can try to hit on this maybe a little bit faster as we close up, but maybe can start with Double Loop's culture, which on your website it says to make games with longevity, you need teams that are sustainable. We're building an environment that's transparent, respectful, and family friendly. You mentioned uh, previously in the conversation about how when you were building Kongragate, how you had some regrets on how that culture was being built and how you felt uncomfortable sometimes. Are there maybe like two or three tidbits that are different this time that you want to call out as being unique and maybe replicable that others can learn from that you're implementing today?
Yeah, it's a little hard to compare because we're starting like we started Double Loop and the pandemic hit six months later.
True.
So we only had there were only four of us when the pandemic started. So we've had to kind of build our company and company culture as a remote, more Zoom first studio. So sometimes it's a little hard to separate like what's different because we've had to build this way versus not. I think that the key thing that I think is most important to building good cultures is something called psychological safety, and this is something like I'd kind of felt, but didn't have a word for. And then a bunch of research came out of Google that talked about it. And I think psychological safety is that kind of sense that you can, come into work, be your true self, voice disagreements, and, feel safe disagreeing with people and having this is rambly. Not I should have looked up the exact definition, but anyway, there's look up psychological safety. But I think the key thing is that when there's psychological safety, there's trust, and I feel like trust is this magical ingredient that makes the world work and makes the world work better. And so when I'm, starting Double Loop, and I think this is something that, honestly was even though we made mistakes at various points, was a key part of Kongragate as well, is the sense of I want to trust you and I need to be trustworthy for you to trust me. And so that means, looking at everybody as individuals, really hearing them and listening to them, assuming kind of best intentions, but also aware that some people aren't going to have those, and dealing with that quickly, but just modeling it as much as possible. People want to trust, people want to be trusted. So if you model it and begin with that in your culture, it tends to replicate, because it is so much easier when you don't have to micromanage or double check or be politicking in your mind. If you can just do something and say something and trust that the other people around you are going to do their jobs and handle it. So to me, that ultimately is the key to create culture. I think the other thing about Double Loop that is a hard thing is that, or actually not a hard thing. You're talking about how you read all these things on our website. We are signaling what we're looking for and what we're expecting of employees very, very hard on our website, and saying, this is who we are, this is what we want, and this is what we want you to be. So that both filters who applies, who's interested, to people who want that kind of culture. And it also signals from the very, beginning moment, the very first conversation you have with us, what the expectations of company and culture are. So I think that thinking about culture and starting with your website, but then making sure that every part of the process, from interviewing to onboarding to, first weeks, that you're, making people feel safe and showing that then that is sort of the best start that you can have to a great culture.
Awesome. We're right at time. Do you mind if I ask you one last question?
Nope.
Awesome. So I know that your story is an inspiration to many people, including me, and I could go, on for another 3 hours just learning from all that you've learned as an entrepreneur, but also just as a prominent woman founder and CEO in the games industry. I know it's especially inspirational for other women who are starting games companies in a still pretty male dominant industry. And so I'm curious to know how you view the industry's progress toward better supporting inclusivity, gender first and foremost, but also otherwise. And then tactically, what should we do as an industry to accelerate better supporting and 10xing the number of the next Emily Greers out there?
Well, thank you. I actually think that there's been a really substantial progress in my time in the games industry. On the one hand, yes, it's still really male dominated. But when I got here, I don't know what the exact numbers were, but it felt like, we were like 10 to 12%. And now I think we're something like, 25%. And on the one hand, you're like, oh, still really male dominated. But I can say, like, as a woman, being one of 10 or one of 4 feels really, really different. And if you're in a room with 20 people and it's 25% women, there, you got a little cohort. And it doesn't feel, it does not, it feels way, way better than it did when you were really literally the only woman in the room. So yeah, I feel like we have passed a threshold that is meaningful in terms of that. Still, especially other kinds of inclusivity, a long way to go. But I feel I can feel it personally. In terms of what we can do, I actually think that kind of building good cultures, building sustainable cultures is, for everybody, benefits the companies, and it benefits inclusivity overall. And that if we just think about it as a inclusivity problem, we're not really getting to the heart of it. We need to think of it as a studio culture problem, and that when a studio culture is toxic, that the people who will be affected by it the most and driven out by it the most are going to be, the non-dominant culture. But it's also driving out a lot of other people too. And that the more that we think about, okay, we're hiring women and they're quitting. Well, that's not about gender as much as it is about everything else that's happening. And so if you focus on kind of the root things that make companies sort of toxic and unsustainable and crunch and all of these like associated behaviors go together, that if you fix those, you will not instantly fix inclusivity, but you will set the conditions where that inclusivity becomes much, much more natural, and you can really build. And, we talk about retention all the time in games. Retention versus acquisition. Sure, there's a funnel problem, but fix your retention first, and then you will build up that culture. I think another thing that's really different that I see now is how, the women who have sort of survived the gauntlet and are now, executives and leading studios and starting studios. There's a bunch of women who have started studios in the last 5 years. I am privileged to be friends with lots of them, and it is something where we support each other, and then we're modeling it for the next generation. So you retain people, they become senior. If you see senior people, you're more comfortable entering it. And I think, to me, those things are what will gradually change it. Both Kongragate and Double Loop have ended up in it where we have way higher normal, women, female representation than standard for the game industry, but also much higher, Latina representation. And I was a woman who was born in Guatemala. I'm not Latina, but I spent a lot of time in Latin America when I was younger. I haven't done anything deliberately, but it seems like non-coincidental that those two things that are part of my background have ended up being overrepresented. But at the same time, we've struggled with Black representation in both companies. So anyway, I think long-winded, but retain people and allow them to grow into leadership positions, and that fixes a lot of things.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing all of that, Emily. And also just thanks for joining me today. This has been a really fun, enlightening conversation. I guess the final question is for those who want to follow along and learn more about either you or Double Loop Games, where should they go?
Yeah. So for me, I'm probably most active on Twitter, where I have the handle Emily G. So yeah, pretty early on Twitter. And then for Double Loop, we've got a Twitter, but I think we're a little more active on Instagram. And then we have our LinkedIn page and website, doubleloopgames.com are the place to go.
Very cool. Well, Emily, thank you again so much for joining me today. This was a great conversation, and I look forward to seeing Double Loop crush it in the years to come.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And to all of our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to give us a like, subscribe, 5 stars. It'd mean a lot. We'll put the links to all things Emily and Double Loop in the episode description below. And of course, if you want to check out all things Naavik, we'll put some links down there as well. And thanks again for listening, everyone. And we'll catch you next time.